It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the Philips 279P1. As usual for a video review, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software, depends on the processing done by YouTube, and ultimately it depends on the screen that you're viewing the video on, so in no way does it accurately represent what the monitor looks like firsthand. This video is part of a written review, and you can find a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. As usual, in-game action will form a large part of this review, and this is a productivity-focused monitor. It isn't a gaming monitor, but just be aware that when I do use in-game examples to show you aspects of the monitor's performance related to contrast, colour reproduction, that kind of thing, it very much applies when you're on the desktop as well, watching something on Netflix, whatever you might be doing. So if you're not a gamer, you're not going to be playing any games with the monitor, the performance characteristics I'm showing off here, the advantages and disadvantages, they apply outside of gaming all the same. This monitor uses a 27-inch IPS panel from Panda, an IPS type panel, with a 60Hz refresh rate and 3840 by 2160, that's 4K UHD resolution. This resolution and screen size combination, it delivers an exceptional pixel density for a monitor. This gives you a great amount of desktop real estate to work with. It gives you excellent clarity when you're looking at suitably high resolution image content. That would include games as well, 4K UHD video content, high resolution photographs, that kind of thing, and also text clarity is very high. At the moment, I'm not using any scaling. I've actually managed to get used to using this monitor without scaling. I would say that most users would probably want to use some scaling. So I'm sitting around 70 centimeters from the monitor usually, and it did take me a bit of adjustment coming from a 27-inch WQHD model. That's 2560 by 1440 or 1440p if you prefer that resolution. But I did get used to this resolution without scaling, and I actually really like it. But I also find the balance using 125% scaling quite nice as well, and in the written review I show you some pictures which compare how things look with no scaling at all, as I'm showing you now, and also with 125% scaling. I've also got an article all about the 4K UHD resolution which shows examples from a screen of this kind of size with various different scaling settings. But the multitasking potential is excellent. So you can get a lot of information on the screen at the same time. And if you're using a bit of scaling, yes, you do lose a bit of that real estate. But unless you're using a very high level of scaling, you're still going to have a good amount of desktop real estate. Another thing to be aware of is that even if you're using scaling or application-specific zoom, so if I zoom into Word, for example, the text remains very crisp. You still benefit from that pixel density. And there's a certain clarity, a certain definition, which you just don't get from models with a lower pixel density. And this isn't something that's lost if you're using scaling. The exception to that would be elements that don't scale cleanly. Fortunately, a lot of elements do scale cleanly. That article I was referring to on the website about the 4K UHD resolution has different scaling settings, that kind of thing. This does go through some examples of things that might not scale cleanly, but as I say, a lot of things do. And certainly this text, Microsoft Word, just browsing the internet, most UI elements in Windows scale just fine. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. So it has a smart home office design. It has a brushed texture. It's plastic, but has a brushed texture to it. Dark matte plastic for the bottom bezel and for this central turntable on the stand base as well. The Philips logo there, shiny silver, and it has a little sensor to the left of it, actually two sensors combined. And that includes an infrared power sensor. What that does is it detects if someone's using the monitor, and if they aren't, it'll dim the screen, and eventually it will send the screen into standby. And there's also a light sensor function which will allow the screen to adapt according to the ambient brightness in the room. This functionality is explored in the OSD video. As are these OSD controls, naturally would be explored in the OSD video, you'd expect that, and indeed they are. The top and side bezels are dual stage, so there's a slim panel border that's flush with the rest of the screen, and it blends in quite nicely when the screen's off. When the screen's displaying an image, as shown elsewhere in this review, you can see that panel border. And then there's a slim hard plastic outer component. This so-called dual stage design, someone will call it borderless. I don't really like that designation, I think it's a bit misleading, but it's quite common on modern monitors anyway. Screen surface is light matte anti-glare, so it doesn't offer the same glare handling characteristics as some stronger matte screen surfaces would, but I didn't have any particular issues with glare. It also means that the image isn't affected as much as it would be on a stronger matte screen surface, and that is explored elsewhere in the review. The positive effects of the screen surface being a bit lighter. At the side, the screen's fairly slim at the thinnest point, but it bulks out centrally where the included stand attaches. At the left side here, you can also see that there are two USB ports. One of them is yellow coloured. They're both USB 3.2 ports, and the yellow coloured one supports fast charging for connected devices. So you can see it has that little lightning bolt logo. Not to be confused with Thunderbolt, of course. The included stand offers good ergonomic flexibility, so you can adjust the height of the screen. So that's at maximum height, and that's at minimum height. And in the written review, I actually give a little measurement where I say how far off the desk it is, the bottom of the screen. But you can see there, it goes nice and close to the bottom of the desk. You can also tilt the screen backwards fairly far, and forwards just a little bit. And you can also swivel it left and right, and that's what the turntable mechanism I was referring to before is used for. It's actually a very generous rotation adjustment there. It's 180 degrees. Sorry, it's technically swivel rather than rotation, because rotation, that is related to the pivot functionality, which this monitor also offers. Which is to say, you can rotate it either clockwise or anti-clockwise into portrait. And again, you can have it nice and low to the desk if you want. It's actually touching the stand base there. That's how low it can go. And that is what it looks like in portrait raised to its maximum height. There's a decent amount of clearance there. At the rear, it's mainly matte black plastic. The rear of the stand neck and also the sides, that's actually powder-coated metal, so it has quite a nice feel to that. The included stand attaches using a quick release mechanism, so if you just push that catch up there, it will release the screen from the stand, and it will reveal 100 by 100mm VESA holes for alternative mounting. Towards the bottom right there, you've got a K-slot. There's a speaker there as well, and another speaker there, so it has two 3-watt speakers, which deliver not exactly the best sound output, but not the worst I've heard from a monitor either. I talk a little bit about that in the written review. There's also a cable tidy loop at the bottom of the stand there, which you can feed your cables through just to keep things a little bit neater. And of course the main thing is the ports and associated features of the monitor there. So you've got an AC power input, which means the monitor has an internal power converter, and also has a 0-watt power switch. So if you want to cut off the monitor power completely, so it isn't drawing any power at all, you can use that switch there. There are then two HDMI 2.0 ports and DisplayPort 1.4. These all support 3840 by 2160 4K UHD at up to 60 Hz. There's a USB-C port, and that supports 65-watt power delivery. It supports DisplayPort Alt mode, and it also supports USB upstream transfer. And actually, that's the only upstream port that's available on this monitor. There isn't a separate USB-A upstream port. So that means if you want to use these things here, the USB ports, or indeed those USB ports at the side, and you want to use them for anything other than just charging devices, then you do actually need to have a USB cable connected to USB-C, even if your system doesn't use USB-C. And the nice thing is that the monitor does actually include a little cable, which is USB Type-C to Type-C, or USB-C to C. It also has a little adapter for one end, the system end, which will turn it into a USB-C to Type-A cable. So that means you can have this just connected to an ordinary USB port rather than USB-C, and you can use it as an upstream cable. There's an RJ45 LAN port and a 3.5mm audio output. Then there are two further USB 3.2 ports. I'm not sure if I mentioned, but the USB ports at the side are also 3.2. I'm now in a game, which shouldn't surprise you given what I said in the introduction to this video, but this is Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I'm going to talk about contrast performance using some in-game examples. So this model, it has an IPS type panel. I measured around 1100 to 1, a little bit above that, static contrast using my test settings. So in no way is that going to give you a great deep atmospheric experience with nice inky looking dark shades, especially when you're sitting in a darker room, as I am at the moment. In addition to that, as an IPS type panel, there's IPS glow to contend with. So this is most noticeable from a normal viewing position when you're getting shot in the game. This is most noticeable from a normal viewing position towards the bottom corners of the screen. And on this model it appears as a generally kind of coolish silver glow emanating from the sides of the screen, particularly the bottom corners from a normal viewing position. But depending on where you're sitting, you might see this more strongly towards the top of the screen as well. It can be brought out by backlight bleed, or other dark uniformity issues that your model might suffer with. My unit does actually have a bit of backlight bleed as well, so this does bring it out a bit more strongly, this IPS glow. It would also be brought out more strongly if you're using a higher brightness or if you're sitting closer to the monitor. Either way, it's your typical IPS characteristic, and the level of IPS glow on this model is really very typical for a 27-inch IPS model. So it is moderate, it is a feature, and it does affect the atmosphere in dark areas. I've brightened the room up a bit now. It isn't a bright room, but it's brighter than it was before. Certainly isn't pitch dark anymore. And the IPS glow, it really doesn't catch the eye as much now, but you can certainly still see it. You'd have to be in quite a bright room for it to be not noticeable at all, but it is certainly something which is more bothersome if the room is darker. Back to the doom and gloom now, and I'm going to talk about an aspect which I really like about IPS type panels like this, and that's the strong gamma consistency. So this means that detail levels are better maintained throughout the screen, dark detail levels. Yes, of course there is IPS glow and that does eat away at detail, but with TN models you get an obvious gradient from top to bottom where detail levels change quite remarkably actually. So if you consider little details like the cracks and crevices in the rock there, even the definition of the vegetation there, on a TN model that is masked very effectively higher up the screen because the perceived gamma is very high, whereas lower down the screen the perceived gamma is much lower and things actually look flooded, can look banded, can look blocky. With VA models you get black crush in the middle, which blends lots of these details together, sort of makes them blend into a dark mass, so you can't see things very distinctly at all, and further out they can have some unintended detail, and again that can give a blocky or banded appearance in places. With IPS type panels like this, the consistency is much better. So throughout the screen, except for the regions affected most strongly by the IPS glow, detail levels are nice and consistent. So really, yes, there's no perfect panel type when it comes to contrast performance. IPS type panels do have their advantages and disadvantages, just like everything else. Considering the brighter shades, such as the light there, I'm just going to adjust the exposure so you can see that a bit more accurately. It looks a little bit more like that in reality. These brighter shades, they have what I call a mild misty graininess, or you might even call it a very slight sandy quality to them, but it isn't a smeary graininess, it isn't a coarse graininess. That's because the screen surface on this model, it's not too bad. It is a light matte anti-glare screen surface. It has a reasonably smooth finish, and actually compared to many 4K UHD models, I find this screen surface less obtrusive. Some of them have this really sort of heavy sandy graininess, which I don't like at all. Sometimes it can look quite smeary, like it has a sort of appearance where it has different planes of sandiness even, if that makes sense. So this model doesn't have that kind of thing. It has more direct emission of light, and just the finish of the surface itself is a bit smoother than some. This is something I'm notoriously fussy about though, screen surface, so I would say that most users are going to be absolutely fine with this screen surface. They're not really going to notice any issues with it at all. I'm now on Lagom, that's lagom.nl, and the tests for viewing angles. I'm going to talk about the colour reproduction of the monitor. I always like to use Lagom at the start because it's a good way of talking about colour consistency, which is an important aspect of colour reproduction. This is an area where IPS models like this really do have a key advantage. So the Lagom text test, that is a blended grey for most of the screen, has a little bit of red to the striping of the text lower down the screen, but it really is quite well blended, certainly better than you see on a TN or VA model. It doesn't have obvious flashes between red and green, saturated red and green, or transition to orange between those, so that indicates that the viewing angle dependency of the gamma curve is low, as you'd hope from a good IPS type panel. The purple block always appears a bit odd on the video, but to the eye it's quite consistent. It has a little bit of a stronger pink hue towards the edges, but actually it's really a pinkish purple throughout the screen. It's just a bit of a stronger pink towards the very edges of the screen, but it's free from the kind of shifts you'd see on TN or VA models. The red block is a good rich red throughout the screen. I don't really have any complaints about this. If I'm being particularly picky, I might say that it's very slightly dimmer towards the very side edges of the screen, but that's quite subtle, and again compared to the shifts you'd see on TN or VA models where you'd have obvious shifts in saturation, they're not there. The green block appears a good saturated green chartreuse throughout. The blue block, as usual, a good rich royal blue throughout the screen. And that's something you often see on TN and VA models as well for this particular shade. I'm now on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. The colour consistency which I showed you with Lagom, that's important in-game as well. Arguably less important when you're sort of focusing on doing well in a competitive game, but if you are focusing on the image itself, you can certainly notice some nice advantages to this strong colour consistency. Basically, that is that there's a richness and a vibrancy that's maintained throughout the screen. It doesn't have some areas of the screen that are less saturated than others, like you get with TN and VA models. So it maintains that rich look throughout the screen. And in terms of vibrancy, this model has quite high vibrancy using its native colour gamut, and that's because the gamut of the monitor extends quite a bit beyond sRGB. Content like this is a game running an SDR. This monitor doesn't support HDR, incidentally. This is designed with the sRGB colour space in mind, and that's the same if you're browsing the internet. Most content that you'd see on the internet, and if you're watching movie content as well, that's all generally SDR content designed for the sRGB colour space. And if you have a larger colour gamut than sRGB on the monitor, it oversaturates things. So you get an increase in vibrancy and saturation. Things look more saturated than they should. And this is a look which some users quite like, but it isn't for everyone. It isn't the same kind of look that you'd get with a digital saturation enhancement. So if you increase the saturation level that some monitors have in their OSD, this model doesn't actually have such a setting, but some do. Or if you were to increase NVIDIA's digital vibrance, for example, what that does is it pulls shades closer to the edge of the gamut without expanding the gamut itself. And with that, you lose shade variety. But if you've just got a wide gamut like you do here, then although you get extra saturation, it's really more of a universal boost in saturation. You maintain the spacing on the gamut so you don't lose the shade variety. So there are lots of autumnal colours here, some rich greens, browns, reds, that kind of thing. They have good pop to them. What I would say though is that, and this fire as well, what I would say is that some of these shades certainly do look more saturated than they should. So on the red end, for example, some of these orange shades verge a bit too much on red, some of the yellowish shades are verging on orange, that kind of thing, but you still get that variety. There's a really nice variety of red, orange and yellow shades, and it certainly looks vibrant. Some patches of brownish red earth and some woody tones on the game, they tend to look sort of a reddish brown, or too much of a reddish brown really. The reddish hues are brought out too strongly, so they don't look as neutral as they should. The wood on the rifles here as well, they have a kind of orangey red look to them which is brought out a bit too strongly. And some of the green shades as well, they can look a little bit off. So the grass here, it's kind of a yellowish green shade, and the yellow components are brought out a bit too strongly. This isn't as extreme as I've seen on some models because this colour gamut isn't super generous, although I did measure 93% of the DCI-P3 colour space. I'm not sure if I mentioned that specifically earlier. At the start of the colour reproduction section of the written review, you can see exactly what I measured. It certainly is enough to bring out some shades too strongly, but it doesn't have this kind of almost nuclear look that some models give these kind of shades, but it certainly is a bit on the oversaturated side. If you're looking to do colour critical work, such as photo editing, that kind of thing on this monitor, you have to be aware that 93% DCI-P3 colour space, it doesn't really give you enough coverage of the DCI-P3 colour space for accurate reproduction there, although some users might still like to work within DCI-P3 on this monitor. It is doable. You just have to be aware of that under coverage, so some shades won't be represented quite as they should. And Adobe RGB, the coverage is 85%, so this really isn't designed for work within the Adobe RGB colour space. But you do benefit from that strong colour consistency that is very useful when it comes to colour accuracy, to have shades represented in much the same way throughout the screen, rather than having these clear shifts in saturation, which would occur on other LCD panel types. And if you do want to work within the sRGB colour space, you're not going to want to have this huge gamut, so you can tame that. The best way to tame that would be to profile the monitor with your own colorimeter or similar device so that you can have the gamut mapped properly and use colour aware applications, which most people will be using if they're photo editing and that kind of thing. That will mean that the ICC profile they create is used correctly. You can download an ICC profile that I created In the written review, it's in the calibration section. Give that a go, and it does have gamut mapping, but be aware that individual units do vary, so it isn't ideal doing that. If you don't have access to this and you're interested in not just these colour-aware applications, but just universal coverage of sRGB without this extra saturation that I've been showing you here, the monitor does offer an sRGB emulation setting. So you go to Colour in the OSD, and then you change this to sRGB. So the first thing I notice with this setting, and it might not be noticeable in the video, but to the eye, is it's much brighter, and that's because it's locked at nearly 300 candela per meter squared. You can't adjust the brightness with this setting. That is an unfortunate restriction. This setting, the sRGB setting, that's actually where the factory calibration of the monitor is based on. And by that, I don't mean that they don't calibrate it carefully in the other presets. That's not the case at all. Actually, the gamma tracking was excellent on my unit outside of this setting, but the monitor does include a factory calibration report, which is unique to each individual unit, and a lot of what they give you there, the measurements they give you, the measurements they've taken, that's based on this sRGB setting. And unfortunately, because the brightness is locked to nearly 300 candela per meter squared, that's brighter than most people would like. 100 to 200 candela per meter squared is where most people's preferences lie. Some people prefer dimmer than that, some people brighter. There are, everyone's eyes are different, but really this is just going to be too bright for most people. But if you can tolerate the brightness, then you get that clamped gamut, so you don't get that extra saturation. Things aren't oversaturated anymore. Things look more as the developers intend, really. So aside from the high brightness, the gamma has also changed, so it doesn't track the 2.2 curve anymore. It tracks sRGB instead, and I say a little bit about that in the calibration section of the written review, but the main thing that does is it lifts up dark shades, it increases your visibility in dark areas. Some people will quite like that, or it might be appropriate for your work perhaps, but the more common target is really just the 2.2 gamma curve, which this monitor follows, or at least my unit followed very closely outside of the sRGB setting. I'm back on Battlefield 5 again, or should that be still on Battlefield 5? I suppose it depends on how you look at things here. And I'm going to talk about responsiveness. This monitor has a 60 Hz refresh rate, and with that you are always going to get, on a sample and hold monitor like this, a moderate amount of perceived blur. There are two main contributors to perceived blur on a monitor. One is the movement of your own eyes as you track motion on the screen, and the other would come from weaknesses in pixel responsiveness. And I'll come on to that second aspect very shortly, but you do always get this moderate amount of perceived blur. So I've got the game running at 60 frames a second. You can see that in the top right there, the little green number there, 60 frames a second. So I'm making the most out of the monitor in terms of its responsiveness. And often when I'm reviewing high refresh rate models, I'll talk about connected feel and how that's improved by increasing the refresh rate, and that is true. So with a 60 Hz refresh rate, you don't get that same connected feel, and again you get that moderate amount of perceived blur due to eye movement, but it's still important to think about connected feel, even though it's 60 Hz. And an important contributor to that particular aspect is input lag. On this model I measured around 7 milliseconds of input lag, so it isn't super low, it certainly isn't particularly high, and especially considering the fact that it's a 60 Hz monitor, most users are going to be just fine with this aspect. It isn't going to be something which you really should worry about. If you are particularly sensitive to input lag and that kind of thing, then I think you're going to have more issues with the 60 Hz refresh rate itself than anything. But moving on now to the pixel responsiveness. On this model, it has a smart response setting, which I've set to fast. I'll show you the other settings with that shortly, but I consider fast optimal. And if you look at the responsiveness section of the written review, where I show pursuit photographs, that shows exactly why this is optimal. It's quite clear that this is the optimal setting. But even with the 60 Hz limitation in mind, there are some weaknesses in pixel responsiveness on this model. So there is what I refer to as powdery trailing. This can be either light or moderate or heavy, depending on how slow the transitions are. On this model, I'd say that in this scene anyway, it's mainly light to medium shades, but there are some darker shades mixed in. And I'd describe this powdery trailing as light to moderate for the most part. So it is actually enough to give an extra mask of perceived blur just as I'm moving my mouse around. You won't be able to see this from the video, unfortunately. It's not something that you can accurately portray in the video. But again, those pursuit photographs in the written review, really very much worth a look if you're interested in this kind of thing. But it just gives this extra mask of blur. It's not a strong mask here, but it is noticeable to me. And the vegetation here, for example, that's actually a mixture of light and dark shades. And there are lots of shadows here. So there's a good mixture of light and dark shades here. And it's really what I'd describe as more of a heavy powdery trailing here. And when I say powdery trail, that's really describes how things would look if you're just moving in one direction and you're viewing the trailing behind the object as you're moving. But when you've got intricate mixtures like this, it does just create this mask of extra blur. These details are simply lost a bit more than they should be during movement. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this is a productivity focused monitor. It's not a gaming monitor. It's not designed for gaming. But even so, that's not an excuse to not tune things as well as can be done. And I know they could have done better with this panel because the Philips 276 E8 VJ-SB is based around the same panel. It has a different feature set and a different backlight, but the actual panel, or I should really say the cell, so that's the panel without the backlight, is exactly the same. And that model had better pixel overdrive, and really the pixel responses were just snappier. A key thing to be aware of though, with that model, I had my smart response setting set to faster. On the two models, I'd say that the fast smart response setting, it's quite similar in both cases. But unfortunately on this model, the faster setting is not usable because there's just a strong amount of overshoot inverse ghosting. I can see bright, colourful halo trailing all over the place. Not sure if this will come across on the video. Sometimes it's annoyingly difficult to capture this on the video, but to my eye there is blindingly obvious overshoot everywhere. On the model, which I'm just going to refer to as 276 because I'm sorry, I hate some of Philips model codes. I really feel sorry for users like yourself trying to remember all of this. It's bad enough as a reviewer. This setting didn't have this kind of overshoot, so it was actually usable and I actually quite liked using it. Unfortunately, it's just completely unusable in this case. If you really love overshoot, you could set it to the fastest setting. I'm not even going to bother showing you that because I'm not even sure if the camera will capture the overshoot properly, but it's already at such a strong level that it's really little chance that users are going to want to use this faster setting, let alone fastest. And off, well, that just gives you extra perceived blur. And actually the fast setting on this model, I wouldn't say there's any reason to set it to off rather than fast. So I'm just going to set it back to my preferred fast setting. So the overshoot I was showing you before has gone. There's sort of a trace of overshoot in places. I'd only call it a trace though. It really isn't strong. It isn't obvious. It isn't eye-catching overshoot. So I think even if you're sensitive to overshoot, you'll find this fast setting fine and you won't see a need to go to the off setting. I'm now on a different scene on Battlefield 5 and this scene has a lot of darker transitions, darker shades being shown, and these can highlight some of the weaknesses in the pixel responsiveness even more clearly. And the good news is that this doesn't give a VA-like level of performance here. So with those you would see clear smearing in a lot of places, such as the boats down here, this flag up here for example. So even fairly well-tuned VA models like the Philips 328 E1CA using its optimal smart response setting, they would show clearer weaknesses here. So this model is faster than that. But even so, there's again some of that what I'd describe as heavy powdery trailing. Some people might even say it's a bit smeary in places. It's sort of quite subjective, open to interpretation, that one. So the makeshift roof here, that does actually show, again I'd call it heavy powdery trailing. It does have a bit of a smeary appearance I suppose. And you can see that over here as well for the wooden elements there, the sky in the background. So these are just transitions which this model really doesn't like performing, where there are some very dark shades with sort of medium to brighter shades in the background. But again, it isn't as slow as you typically see on VA models, but isn't as fast as I saw on that other Philips IPS model, which I mentioned earlier, the 276. There's nothing really stand out in the way of overshoot though, so that's good. There's a little bit of halo trailing behind the tree there, just a little bit of trailing which is a little bit brighter than the background colour and of course brighter than the tree trunk itself. So it kind of slightly stands out for that reason, but only very slightly. Not something that most users are going to notice or take issue with. And just for comparison again, the faster smart response setting. The overshoot is really strong now. I'm sort of hoping this will come across on the video. I'd be kind of surprised if it didn't, because it's really very strong. But I hope you can see now why this setting is completely unusable, unless you're really super tolerant to overshoot and you don't mind, because it does technically get rid of what I was describing as heavy powdery or slightly smeary trailing, but it just replaced it with overshoot instead. I mean, I would take the sort of powdery trailing over this overshoot personally, but I guess that's a personal preference. I just think that the overshoot level here is too strong. I've significantly increased my graphics settings, so you can see my frame rate has dropped to closer to 40 frames a second now, and I've also changed back to my preferred setting for overdrive or smart response, which is fast. And I'm going to talk about adaptive sync. This monitor doesn't officially support or advertise adaptive sync as a feature, and that does mean that it may not work with your GPU at all, and it may not work properly if it does work. So with my RTX 3090, which I'm using at the moment, I've got G-Sync compatible mode active. I could activate that. It's using adaptive sync, and for higher frame rates or higher refresh rates, it does work properly. So it does what you'd expect. The refresh rate of the monitor is adjusting to match the frame rate, and it does that if the frame rate is between 38 and 60 Hertz. It's actually quite a broad range of operation, and it works just fine, gets rid of tearing and stuttering. So if I had this technology disabled and I had the kind of fluctuations I'm seeing in frame rate at the moment, so it certainly isn't sticking to 60, if I had VSync disabled, I would get obvious tearing, obvious to me, I'm sensitive to that kind of thing. Or if I had VSync enabled, I'd get obvious stuttering, again, obvious to me, obvious to people who are sensitive to that kind of thing. But I don't get those interruptions with adaptive sync active, G-Sync compatible mode active, so that's nice. With my AMD GPU, I couldn't activate FreeSync at all, so I couldn't use adaptive sync, didn't let me. And the key reason for that is that this monitor really isn't set up for adaptive sync. So I know that sounds a bit weird because I just said it was working fine, but the problem is that when that frame rate drops below 38 frames a second, which does happen from time to time, even if you've got a very powerful GPU like I do at the moment, RTX 3090, there might be cutscenes in games, loading screens, or just some momentary sort of spikes down below 38. I'm just going to increase the graphics settings a little more to try and trigger this. Yeah, I've increased the graphics settings further, and it seems that my frame rate's actually gone up a bit. Ah, yeah, there we go. You might be able to see these strange artifacts on the screen. So basically, the screen flickers and shows these weird artifacts when it goes below 38 frames a second. Monitor tries to go below 38 Hertz, but it can't actually do that. So there essentially isn't a flaw of operation, as there should be with adaptive sync. What should happen is it should just deactivate and just go back to how it was before, not using adaptive sync. But instead, it tries to use the technology at refresh rates it just doesn't support. So it is kind of usable on some systems, as long as you're getting consistently high frame rates above 38 frames a second at least, or if you don't mind the occasional strange artifact here and there. But it really isn't an officially supported feature. And again, using my preferred fast setting here, the overshoot becomes a bit more pronounced at these reduced frame rates, but it's never particularly eye-catching, so it's still what I'd say is quite a low level of overshoot, especially for an adaptive sync monitor. So there's no variable overdrive or anything like that. The overdrive doesn't retune itself just because the refresh rate has reduced. Ideally it would do that. So really this fast setting is usable throughout the adaptive sync range if you are brave enough to use adaptive sync on this monitor, or try to. And I have to say, I did actually just leave adaptive sync on, but again, my RTX 3090 is quite powerful, so most of the time I have no problem at all maintaining a good frame rate. And actually, most of the time, to be fair, it wouldn't be used anyway, because I'd be at 60 frames a second solidly. All right for some, isn't it? To wrap up then, the exterior design of the monitor, nothing particularly thrilling there, but it does the trick. Smart home office design, good ergonomic flexibility, felt quite solid as well. Has a bit of powder-coated metal at the back and to the side of the stand neck, which I quite like. I also found the power sensor feature quite useful, the little sensor there which dims the screen or sends it into standby if nobody's detected. That worked very nicely for me. I quite liked that feature. The 27-inch 3840 by 2160 4K UHD screen, I got on well with that. I could actually use it without scaling, but most users will want to use scaling. And I do often say when I'm reviewing 31.5 or 32-inch models with this resolution that I see that as the sweet spot for this resolution, and I'd still agree with that. But even so, that doesn't mean that it's useless having this resolution with a 27-inch screen. Far from it. You get an excellent pixel density, which you can really make very good use of. Even if you're using scaling, you're still making very good use of that pixel density. The contrast performance, largely as I'd expect, a little bit above the 1000:1 specified, but you get that moderate amount of IPS glow, which is definitely a feature. The screen surface was quite agreeable, really. Light matte anti-glare with a reasonably smooth finish. Just gave a light misty graininess, the kind of graininess which most users either won't notice or won't be bothered by. Meanwhile, the light quality to the screen surface, that kept things looking quite clear with quite direct emission of light without the kind of layering that you can get with stronger matte screen surfaces. The colour reproduction is really the main strength of this model, and it offered excellent colour consistency. The colour gamut is quite generous, 93% of the DCI-P3 colour space, extends quite a bit beyond sRGB, gives a rich look, a vibrant look that some users will quite like, and it still remains varied, but that kind of look isn't for everyone. This model does offer an sRGB emulation setting, and that's actually what the factory calibration that you'll have the report for is based around. Unfortunately, the brightness is locked to a very high level, or relatively high level, I should say. I mean, it's not super high compared to some monitors, but it is nearly 300 candles per meter squared, which is simply brighter than most users would want to use. And giving the user no flexibility to adjust this means that a lot of the time they're just not going to find this setting at all practical, and even if they want to use it, they're not going to be able to. When it came to responsiveness, the monitor had a decent input lag. It wasn't super low, but wasn't particularly high either. Shouldn't bother most users, especially because it's a 60Hz monitor. It is a productivity-focused monitor. It isn't designed for gaming, but even so, I do like to test out the responsiveness of monitors using gaming. And I would say that whilst it isn't perfect, it is better than what you'd typically see on a VA model, even well-tuned VA models. So it isn't awful. I'm just being a bit picky here, I suppose. But one of the reasons for that is that I compared this to the Philips 276E8 VJSB, which is based around the same panel. And unfortunately, that means that I know that this panel is capable of more than they got out of it here with the smart response setting. So you should have been able to set that to somewhere between fast and faster, or they should have had the faster setting tuned so it gave less overshoot. I know that should be technically possible because of what I've seen from other monitors based around the panel. So that left me a little bit disappointed, to be honest, in terms of the pixel responsiveness. But again, I wouldn't say it's awful, and really for what this monitor is designed for, it's perfectly adequate. You know, when I was on the desktop or when I was watching 24 to 30 frames a second content on Netflix, and that's most content on Netflix, for example, I really didn't give much thought to the pixel response weaknesses. They didn't really stand out in a clear way. It doesn't have any sort of obnoxious weaknesses like some VA models would have, where you get sort of these clear weaknesses which you'd even notice when you're on the desktop. If you're focused more on the kind of gaming side, or you do like to do quite a bit of gaming, even if you're happy with a 60Hz refresh rate, perhaps you're using a games console, a modern games console, or you might be using a PC and you want to get a nice solid 60 frames a second experience with decent pixel responsiveness, I would actually consider that 276E8 VJSB. It's actually quite a lot cheaper than this model as well, but it doesn't have the same feature set or capabilities, it doesn't have the same wide gamut, it doesn't have the USB-C port, and actually, if you think about the feature set of this monitor, 279P1, it actually is quite well priced for the feature set it has. So, I mean, I have to commend Philips for that. I just think that my two main criticisms would really be around the pixel overdrive tuning, and also the fact that the sRGB setting, which is really the key factory calibrated mode of the monitor, is locked to a quite obnoxiously high brightness level. So that's really all there is to the Philips 279P1. Be sure to check out the full review on pcmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.